A Modest Proposal was written by Jonathan Swift, who lived from 1667 to 1745. He was born of English parents in Dublin and educated at Dublin's Trinity College. After graduation, he went to live with his relatives in England. Since he really didn't know what he wanted to do with his life, he rather reluctantly decided on the church as a career and became a minister in the Protestant Anglican Church. Having grown up in Ireland, which he felt was like the end of the earth, Swift always wanted to live in England. He was happy living with his relatives and working as a minister. Unfortunately, when he was 32, the church was searching for a new chaplain to the Lord Justice of Ireland and decided that with his Irish background, Swift would be the perfect candidate for the post. So off he went, back to the place he most wanted to leave. He had hopes of returning to England one day, but in 1713 he was made Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin and knew that he'd be in Ireland for the rest of his life. He decided that if he was destined to live in Ireland, he would make the best of it. Roughly 10 years later, in 1724, Swift became the leader of the Irish resistance movement against English oppression. You see, England was using Ireland as something of a factory state. There was cheap labor there, and English business people would have the Irish create products for sale on the English market, products that the Irish themselves could never afford to purchase. The English also owned most of the property in Ireland, so the workers were at the mercy of their absentee landlords. A lot of money was going from Ireland to England, but very little was coming back the other way. So while he was leading the resistance, Swift used the alias of M.B. Drapier. You can see the cover of one of his many pamphlets on the left. On the right is the title page to his book Works, published in 1735, showing Swift receiving the thanks of Ireland and the smashing of Wood's halfpence. The Latin inscription from Horace says, "I have made a monument more lasting than brass." To give you an idea of just how much the Irish people admired him, you should know that England put out a £300 reward for anyone who would tell them the actual identity of M.B. Drapier, a staggering amount of money back then. And although it is said that all of Dublin knew who he was, not one person turned him in for the reward. Swift is still a national hero in Ireland. The only woman in his life was Esther Johnson, whom Swift met when he was living in England. She eventually moved to Dublin, where she and Swift spent a lot of time together. There were rumors that they were secretly married, but no one really knows for sure. She might have just been a close companion. Swift wrote and published A Modest Proposal in 1729, and he had several reasons for doing so. First, he was angry at England for his what he considered his exile in Ireland, which only served to intensify his anger about the way that England was mistreating the Irish. Next, because Ireland was always resistant to English rule, it was in England's best interest to keep Ireland weak and dependent militarily, politically, and economically, because a weak Ireland couldn't threaten England. The measures that kept it weak were also profitable for the English. Ireland was full of beggars. It suffered periodical famines, was overpopulated, and also it was heavily taxed by the English, and the Irish had no say at all in their own affairs. Most of the land in Ireland was owned by English absentee landlords. Irish factories were deliberately crippled so that they couldn't compete with those in England. Irish Catholics made up the largest and poorest segment of society. Swift was not only angry at the English, but at the Irish, who he saw as passively allowing this to happen to them. He wrote his proposal in an attempt to wake them up to their situation. He had made several proposals to the Irish Parliament in order to improve conditions, but they were always ignored. A Modest Proposal shows his frustration and disgust at the whole situation. Rhetorically, A Modest Proposal is incredibly sophisticated. In fact, it is often said to be the most perfect example of rhetorical writing ever created, in that it requires that we accept and reject its premise at the same time. In order to say, no, we shouldn't eat these children, we have to say to ourselves that yes, he is making a good argument here. And if he wasn't talking about people, but just things, he would be making a lot of sense. In his introduction to the text, David Cody states, quote, behind the Ma's proposer, that is, stands an enraged and sardonic Swift, asking both sides whether the whole matter is not merely a question of degree, a question of the extent to which a human being, the manipulator or the manipulated, can be dehumanized, and that dehumanization is at the center of this whole essay. He continues, once the process of dehumanization gets underway, as it obviously is, in a country in which no one, not even the unfortunates themselves, seems to mind or object to the fact that tens of thousands of human beings starve to death every year, where can one calmly, sanely, and logically draw the line and say, thus far and no further? Cody continues, a modest proposal is a manifestation of Swift's sense of anger and frustration, and as such it is merely the most savage, the most brutal, the most heavily ironic of the numerous tracts which he produced during the early 18th century in an attempt to shame England and to shock Ireland out of its lethargic state. He finishes by saying, it is a ghastly masterpiece, cunningly devised, horribly plausible, deviously manipulative. It remains for the reader to come to terms with it, to comprehend it, and to determine the extent to which, oddly enough, it might be relevant to our own world. End quote. And if you think about it, it is incredibly relevant to our own world. Are we using human beings in the same way that the English were in Swift's day? You bet we are. This is the original title page to his essay. His proposal is for, quote, preventing the children of poor people in Ireland from being a burden to their parents or country and for making them beneficial to the public. Let's take a closer look at some of the things he includes in his proposal. I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children in the arms or on the backs or at the heels of their mothers, and frequently of their fathers, is in the present deplorable state of the kingdom a very great additional grievance, and therefore whoever could find out a fair, cheap, and easy method of making these children sound, useful members of the Commonwealth would deserve so well of the public as to have his statue set up for a preserver of the nation. So far, this seems reasonable. I mean, if we can take these children, who are a burden not only to their parents but also the taxpayers, and make them useful and able to earn their own keep, it's a win-win situation for everybody. He says, I propose to provide for them in such a manner as instead of being a charge upon their parents or the parish, or wanting food and raiment for the rest of their lives, they shall on the contrary contribute to the feeding and partly to the clothing of many households, or many thousands. Still sounding good, don't you think? It will prevent those voluntary abortions and that horrid practice of women murdering their bastard children, alas too frequent among us, sacrificing the poor innocent babes, I doubt, more to avoid the expense than the shame, which would move tears and pity in the most savage and inhuman breast. So an additional benefit from his plan. Swift notes that 120,000 poor children are born every year in Ireland. The parents can't sell them before they're 12, in other words, send them off to work in a factory or to work as an apprentice. Of course, even then, they'll get no more than £3 for their children, which is a pittance when you consider that the parents had to spend at least 4 times that on rags and food while they were raising them. That comes out to be about £1 per child per year. Then he comes down to the details of his proposal. I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young healthy child well nursed is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it would equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout. Note that the idea comes from an American, a person living in the uncivilized colonies. I mean, who knows if they practice cannibalism over there? So his plan is to turn some of the children into breeders, and that the remaining 100,000 may at a year old be offered in sale to the persons of quality and fortune through the kingdom. always advising the mother to let them suck plentifully in the last month, so as to render them plump and fat for a good table. A child will make 2 dishes at an entertainment for friends, and when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish, and seasoned with a little pepper and salt, will be very good boiled on the 4th day, especially in winter. This is no longer a child, but a piece of meat to be served at the dinner table. He says, I grant this food will be somewhat dear, and therefore very proper for landlords who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children. This is a nice little jab. The greedy landlords have already sucked the parents dry, so why not go ahead and eat the children too? Those who are more thrifty, as I must confess the times require, may flay the carcass, the skin of which, artificially dressed, will make admirable gloves for ladies and summer boots for fine gentlemen. If we're going to treat 'em like meat, let's use their leather like we would cows or goats or sheep, any other type of meat that we'd eat. So what about the sick and the elderly? But I am not in the least pain upon this matter, because it is very well known that they are every day dying and rotting by cold and famine, and filth and vermin, as fast as can be reasonably expected. Another advantage of this practice is that men would become as fond of their wives during the time of their pregnancy as they are now of their mares and foal, their cows and calf, or sows when they are ready to farrow, nor offer to beat or kick them, as is all too frequent practice, for fear of a miscarriage. Not only children would be considered a commodity, but their mothers would be as well, making them more valuable to their husbands and apt to be treated more humanely. He drives home his point, addressing his audience directly. I desire those politicians who dislike my overture, and may perhaps be so bold to attempt an answer, that they will first ask the parents of these mortals whether they would not at this day think it a great happiness to have been sold for food at a year in the manner I prescribe, and thereby have avoided such a perpetual sense of misfortunes as they have since gone through, by the oppression of landlords, the impossibility of paying rent without money or trade, the want of common sustenance, with neither house nor clothes to cover them from the inclemency of the weather, and the most inevitable prospect of entailing the like or greater miseries upon their breed forever. Who in the end would choose a life such as these people are living now? Wouldn't it be more humane to put them out of their misery early on in life, rather than to subject them to a life of hunger, poverty, and the likelihood of eventual starvation? As I said, Swift's proposal still resonates today. How often do we dehumanize people in order to make our own lives more comfortable? We still have sweatshops and people living in shacks so that we can keep the price of our food and clothing to a minimum. Swift forces us to step back, to think about what we were doing, and to calculate the real cost of the things we buy. Thank you.